Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 13 of my series on the myth of authority. Today, we're continuing our discussion about the transition to a free society from the perspective of the myth of authority. This episode is going to bring together almost everything we've covered. I'll be drilling down to show how these various components we've covered fit into a solid foundation, a foundation that supports one of the most important and impactful white pills of all. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to review all the previous episodes, which I've linked to. But still, in preparation, let me review some of the key points recently covered. I explained how the transition is essentially the process of the erosion of the myth of authority. As you know, the myth of authority is the cause, the root cause of the state. So, the status of the myth along the way will determine the status of the state. As the myth erodes, support for the state erodes. Essentially, the myth of authority is always the measuring stick of the transition's progress. Also, I suggested that the transition is already underway, precisely because the myth of authority had started to be questioned over these last 50 years. That's when we saw the start of solid intellectual grounding in anarcho-libertarianism. This began the foundational challenge to the myth of authority. Had all that been just a flash in the pan, if it had died out, then of course we could not say that any sort of transition had started. But no, instead, the questioning of the myth of authority has continued to spread and grow. Admittedly a small growth, but growth nonetheless. Of course, it's possible I'm wrong about this. After all, the myth remains very entrenched today. But it's clear the trend is not headed backwards to the old days of 100% blind faith in statism. No, the trend is forward. It seems quite plausible that the undermining of the myth of authority is here to stay. I also talked about the real players in this story, the two sets of people who matter. One group is the vast majority who believe the myth of authority, and the second group is who I call the state bullies, the people who hold actual coercive power over the majority. We covered the actual numbers, in the US that is, which are eye-opening. About 330 million people comprise the majority as the victims of the myth, and the state bullies number about 3 million, and they are the outward result of the myth. They hold the power. They are the ones allowed to use guns to keep the 330 million in line. That's why I call them the bullies. And I discussed how none of these state bullies, none of those 3 million, actually speak for the collective state, and how they don't share a hive mind. This means the state, meaning the bullies, is not strategizing in the context of the transition. The 3 million are simply operating on self-oriented incentives. And all this clarifies the question, who exactly influences the transition? It's the two groups, the myth believers and the bullies. And now we have a realistic sense of their numbers. 3 million bullies governing 330 million. A nice ratio, if you ask me. Okay, so now let's dive back in. There are several pieces of the puzzle I'll be bringing together now. Let me just list them here to give the framework. First, those three major periods of human history I mentioned. 1, before the transition starts. 2, the transition period. And then 3, post-transition. Period 1 is all of human history, right up to about the 1960s or 70s, which was when the formal undermining of the myth of authority began. A very, very long span of history. During all of period 1, the myth of authority is never being questioned, at least not sustainably. And therefore statism is always on solid ground. Period 2 is the transition itself, the time during which the myth is being questioned and eventually eroding. In turn, the state is impacted directly, since it's always the downstream effect of the myth. As time passes, the myth erodes and the state follows. When the myth finally dissolves away, the state dissolves away in turn. The transition, period 2, is over. And period 3 is everything after that. The transition is over because the myth is over, which means the state is done. We have stateless societies from then on. They, of course, have legal frameworks in private law, private property, etc., but all that would have already formed back during the transition. The big point about period 3 is that it's immune from the state. The myth died out already, so whatever potential bullies exist have no meaningful ground on which to build up statism. Now, regarding those eventual free societies, I don't want to be misinterpreted as saying a free society's people will be magically immune from any and all manipulations. So let me take a small tangent here about that. Psychological manipulation will probably never be eliminated from mankind. There will always be vulnerable people, easily manipulated, like people with low self-esteem. They may well end up in bad situations. Why? Because their vulnerability will always attract manipulators and bullies. They unknowingly establish an opening for the abuser to fog up their mind. You might say it's a myth of authority applicable only to them. So sadly, they may end up with a person in the household who abuses them and keeps them believing they need their abuser. Or another example, some people will probably still end up in cults. They'll have a kind of myth of authority about the cult, because their vulnerability will be an attractive pathway for manipulators, in this case, cult leaders, who, likewise, will make members believe they profoundly need the cult, like their life and happiness depends on it. So yes, manipulation will happen even in free societies, but at least it will be localized and dispersed. You won't have generations of entire populations believing the myth of political authority. You won't have this as an environment that attracts the bullies and manipulators. Okay, anyway, those are the time periods. Next, we have, as I previously mentioned, the two sets of players, the majority, who hold the myth, and the state, the result of the myth, the 330 million myth believers, and the 3 million state bullies. So the components so far are those three time periods and the two sets of players. Now, another component we'll examine is the nature of our players, their psychological natures. And this is important to remember. Their natures do not change. The outward results, the human actions they take, they do change, of course. But the players' inherent natures do not. So what are these natures? For the majority, their nature is their true selves, that being the natural part of them, who value their private authority over their body and property. Plus, because of the myth, they also have a second nature, what I've called their false self, the part created by the fog of indoctrination from the myth. This part of their nature is easily manipulated and duped. And then we have the nature of the bullies, their desire to rule others. This can be as simple as having a personality type we might call a busybody, or it can be a full-on psychopath who gets off on manipulating others. Wherever it falls on the spectrum, it's their nature to be this way. They want to boss others around. Okay, that's their natures. Next, we have the interaction between the two players, between their natures, the interplay of their psychologies. Now think about that. The interaction itself is part of all this. Alone, these psychologies mean very little. For example, if you have people who believe the myth, but you don't have any actual manipulators out there, well, then that myth goes nowhere. It's an empty belief. Or the opposite. Say you have manipulators, but nobody who believes those guys have a right to bully them. Then these potential bullies have no outlet, no willing victims. No, you need both there to interact. The interaction of the two players determines statism itself. So those are all the components. We have the two sets of players, the people and the bullies. We have their natures, with the people believing the myth and the bullies taking advantage of that. We have the interactions of those two players that determine how much statism we have. And finally, we have the three time periods in which we'll study these dynamics: pre-transition, transition, and free society. Running across all those time periods is that common thread, the strength of the myth of authority and its intersection with the bullies. That interaction determines what level of statism we see during each one of those three time periods. And I hope this helps show how all of it is a psychological dynamic, not a planned out design. What we see in the real world at any stage is sort of a to be expected result of the psychology in play. That's important because it helps temper our thinking, give us perspective on how much control we really have. It might feel satisfying to imagine that statism was planned into existence, but no, it grew out of the myth. It might feel satisfying to imagine that a free society will likewise get planned into existence, but no, a free society will just be whatever happens in societies without the myth of authority permitting legally empowered bullies. So while we have some influence, it's really not as much as we'd like to imagine. Rather, it's the dynamics of psychology that assert itself, especially when there's vulnerability interacting with craving for power. The three periods of history provide three differing environments where those dynamics play out. And in particular, the transition period will provide who knows how many shifting environments as the dynamics change along the way. Let me support this another way, because I know to a lot of listeners this could be a hard to swallow truth. They don't want to consider that there's only so much they can do to change things. Notice something obvious. Virtually no one clearly identifies the cause and effect of how the myth leads to the state. Okay, now notice this at the same time. We have the state. How? How is it the state exists when no one is actually thinking it through, turning the levers and knobs of society so the cause, the myth, produces the effect, the state? We don't see an explicit design process, so to speak, happening. And yet we have the state bullies and the entire state apparatus. Interesting, isn't it? There's a genuine cause and effect happening, myth leads to state, and yet it's unplanned. Well, it's precisely because the myth doesn't have to be understood by the majority. The myth only has to exist. And it's the same for bullies. They, too, don't need a clear understanding of the myth. It's enough that they want to dominate. That's why the psychology of the two players is so important. The vulnerability of people due to the myth and the bully's desire for power. So it's not about design. Let's say you actually wanted to see statism happen. Well, no design is needed. You'll get it just as long as those elements are present. Or let's say you don't want statism. Well, sorry, no design can stop it as long as those elements are present. You can see for yourself how a clear understanding is unnecessary. Think of any politician, cop, judge, any of the bullies. Do you for 1 second think they have this secret insight that the myth of authority is the foundation of their power? No way. They are as clueless as everyone else about that psychology. Nobody has to actually think through any of this for it to happen. I'm sure a few of the real psychos in politics jump into this environment fully intending to dominate others, but I think most of them gravitate to it unconsciously. They're motivated by the environment itself and from whatever character traits make them bossy or manipulative. This segues nicely into another psychological aspect of this, the codependency of statism. So we have those two pillars of statism, the majority who believe the myth and the bullies themselves. Now, yes, they are pillars, but unequal pillars, and yet they are codependent. So first let's see why they are unequal. The first obvious reason is because one causes the other. The myth has to exist before the bullies can assume power. One must exist first. They're unequal. Also, we know they're not equal numerically. The bullies are severely outnumbered. Remember, we have 3 million of them ruling over 330 million. They wouldn't stand a chance against such a majority if the people saw them as mere mortals, as moral equals. No, there has to be a myth of authority behind it to explain that astounding inequality. And finally, they are unequal because one is passive, the other is active. The myth is passive. It's just there, a belief in the validity of the state. But the bullies are active. They have to act to take advantage of the myth, and of course, act to keep up the myth. But here's the twisted psychology. Unequal they may be, but so long as the bullies have political power, the two players are utterly codependent. The myth depends on the state, meaning its propaganda, and the state depends on the myth, so it can exist. They depend on each other, a toxic codependency. Once you have this codependency, you have statism. See how statism requires those two pillars to hold it up? Not just the myth in the minds of the majority, but also the bullies themselves, the actual living, breathing people, those who want to rule over others. Two codependent components. We're going to stay on this to make sure it's crystal clear, because the bullies' part in all this has not gotten enough attention so far. We've spent most of this series talking about how the majority are indoctrinated by the myth and how that explains why they tolerate the state. But we haven't yet emphasized the critical role the bullies themselves play as a pillar of statism. Think about it. It actually isn't enough all by itself that the majority believe the myth and be willing to permit the bullies their power. Because a feeling of willingness is just that, a feeling. It's only an internal thing, a psychological vulnerability. It's not an action, is it? The belief alone doesn't magically bring rulers into existence. All it is a willingness. You need something else. You need the bullies themselves. Those bullies have to come along, the actual people who want to do the bullying. They must exist. They need brains to process the fact that huge mass of people are willing to be ruled over. Their nature must be tempted by the willingness of all those people, tempted to boss them around, and to physically act, to accept power and rule over them. The bullies have a sense that draws them to power, a radar that detects vulnerability in people who are more than willing to go along, people who don't just tolerate them, but support and fund them. Again, they don't need to understand this psychology. What's way more important is their nature, desiring to boss others around. That's what gives them that radar to see the vulnerability of others. It's important you remember this because it's key to how the transition plays out. So, to repeat the psychological pieces of the puzzle, necessary piece 1 is the people have to want to be ruled. The myth of authority takes care of that part. Necessary piece 2 is the bullies have their nature, a radar that detects the people want to be ruled. The bullies then act accordingly. Let me illustrate this by reminding you how statism is virtually identical to a cult, only on a larger scale. The cult members believe this myth that the leader is moral and good and necessary to their survival, so they're more than willing to support the cult. But the leader is part of the dynamic too. You can't have a cult without someone who craves power over others. Without him, those people would have been doing something else with their lives. That makes the leader, like our state bullies, a necessary part of the equation. He has to exist and keep the act going. Two pillars holding up cults, the belief and the cult leader. Just like statism, you need both. The myth that thinks we're dependent on the bullies and the bullies that depend on the myth. The toxic codependency. Okay, so with all of that, now we can see more clearly the cause and effect I've been talking about from the start. The myth as the cause, the state as the effect. But now with greater detail. The myth, the cause, but a passive cause. Like a magnet just sitting there. The magnet's not acting. It passively has a nature, creating an environment attractive to metal. Think of the myth of authority that way. A belief that passively sits there, creating a certain environment, an environment attractive to power seekers. That's our cause. How about the effect, the state bullies? Oh no, far from being passive, they need to be quite active. They need to be attracted to the vulnerability caused by the myth. They have to go for the power. And even then, they're not done. They can't become passive. They have to be actively working to keep the myth going. That's the propaganda. They cannot rest. They have no choice but to work tirelessly. If they don't, too many people wake up and statism falls. Okay, so now here it comes. We're going to tie together all the pieces. Pay close attention because this will now connect back to the transition and ultimately a massive white pill. We've got this myth of authority fogging up the minds of people, the vast majority. As I mentioned in the very early episodes, people's behavior reflect the myth. They act it out in certain ways. They wave flags and salute. They talk in terms of being led around by politicians. They indoctrinate their kids. They speak in vague collective terms. All these actions by all these people across all of society, all this is part of the environment. It's an aspect of the environment, a look and feel of it. There's a sense in the air about these attitudes and behaviors. The myth has established an environment, like how that magnet creates an environment attractive to metal, or like a slab of raw meat sitting in the sun, an environment attractive to flies. The myth creates this fertile ground environment where people are essentially signaling that they are perfectly fine with political rulers, even fine with paying for the privilege of being ruled over. That willingness I mentioned is known. It's in the air. You might say it's advertised. Well, here it is. One of the most important lessons of this Myth of Authority series, remember this well. This environment is attractive to the state, attractive to the bullies who want to rule over others. They like seeing that people desire to be ruled. They smell it. They sense a favorable environment. Just like raw meat is conducive to flies, the Myth of Authority is conducive to the state. The bullies see a green light for their impulse to rule others. In this welcome environment, they can fulfill that craving. So now, our analysis is supercharged. Now we can examine our periods of history in the context of the environment of the myth, whether the myth is powerful or partially strong or weak or outright dead. Each of these establishes its own unique environment. And the potential bullies, well, they find themselves within any given one of these environments. How they act depends on how favorable the environment happens to be. So in particular, During the period of transition to a free society, the changing status of the myth results in different environments for the bullies. Now, still, all this may sound theoretical, especially if I'm talking about how the transition will play out later as the myth weakens. So let me provide an actual, real-world example to help solidify the importance of the myth's impact on the environment. Once again, let's return to the days of the Soviet Union. For about 70 years, the Soviet Union persisted. It was a real mess from start to finish, but it had the support of the people, fed by the propaganda that the government was legitimate and good and necessary, the whole 9 yards. People believed the myth, and this maintained a favorable environment for their form of statism. Until about the late 1980s, 1990, lots of things happened, but we can simplify all that by looking at the environment. The legitimacy of the government of the Soviet Union was declining in various countries that were part of the Soviet Union. People started to question it and even started wanting them out of the picture. The myth was weakening regarding the Soviet Union government. The environment was no longer conducive or favorable to the Soviet Union bullies. We all know what happened. In fairly short order, that government dissolved, and I might add, fairly peacefully. So you see how it was the environment that led to that? More proof. Along with that, notice the people still held the myth of authority, but only for a government more local to them. For example, the people in Poland wanted a Polish government. The people in Hungary wanted a Hungarian government. And there you go. The environment was now favorable to that. And what happened? It attracted their local bullies in Poland, Hungary, etc. The environment of the myth determined statism all the way. For 70 years, an environment favorable to Soviet Union statism, which is what they got. Then, the environment changed, less welcoming to the Soviet Union bullies, or at least enough to be noticeable, so those bullies backed off, but still favorable to a new set of bullies, who were all too eager to take over. Okay, that's the Soviet Union example. Let's now look at the myth of authority environment, but this time using our 3 split historical time periods. Period 1 is all of history until maybe 50 years ago. The myth of authority was bulletproof. We had always an attractive environment for bullies, and along they came. The result? Statism. This co-dependency persisted solidly, no challenges. All those thousands of years in period 1, always a super favorable environment for statism. Bulletproof myth attracts inevitable statism. That's the environment of period 1. Period 2, the transition, started about 50 years ago. Now, right now, at this particular stage of it, the myth remains very entrenched. It continues to establish this attractive environment for bullies, and they respond accordingly, acquiring power. No shock. The state remains nice and solid, all because we still have a favorable environment for bullies. Now, even today, the environment of the myth of authority is shifting, and we're going to definitely cover that. But I'll leave that for a future episode because it's very meaty and even more white-pilling, and I'll want to give that practically a whole episode. So now let's do this one last time. Look at the environment in period 3, post-transition. In a free society, the myth of authority is dead. No people in that world are indoctrinated into believing in political rulers. So, the environment in that world is not influenced by the myth at all. The people never indicate, never advertise that they want to be ruled over. They never take actions. They never express attitudes. They never say things that indicate they want that. There's nothing evident in this environment that suggests a desire to have others rule their lives. To any potential bullies, this environment is unattractive, unwelcoming. It's not conducive to statism. So, What are the potential bullies doing? I don't know exactly, but for sure, not getting elected, not getting paid to rule others. They can't succeed as bullies, at least not bullies of a state. Sure, as I said before, they may bully people one-on-one, abusive households, cults, but those are outliers. They're not population-wide. So the bullies' incentives will draw them elsewhere. They have to get along in life doing other things. Most importantly, they cannot pose a threat to the free society. No myth, no state. Okay, we're about done for today. As a teaser for next time, though, let's think about now, this very, very early stage of the transition. Sure, it looks a whole lot like pre-transition. The myth is still very powerful. Pretty much everyone still believes it. Super conducive environment for the bullies. So, very powerful state. Not exactly headline news. Oh, but there is a small difference. The pre-transition environment was oh so attractive. But here, at the start of the transition, that environment is starting to shift, little by little. Microscopically, yes, but changing. It's getting just a smidge bit less attractive to the bullies. So just take that trend and move it forward a bit. The myth gets undermined even more over the coming 5 to 10 years. How do the bullies respond to this changing environment? Do you suppose they feel the same incentives as before? Does it feel the same as before? Bullies can do things in life other than politics, so will they feel the exact same desire to gravitate to politics as bullies from earlier generations? After all, the new environment doesn't feel quite as welcoming. This will lead to one of the most eye-opening of all the insights in this series, the fact that the bullies themselves, yes, the state itself, if you want to use that term, these actual people, are going to play a personal role in the transition. I know, we like to think of this movement as a grand liberation of humanity, and I actually agree, it is. But a lot of us like to think of we libertarians as the drivers along that road. I suppose in a small way, yes, but far more likely is this monster white pill. While we're all traveling along during the transition, the bullies of the state may just decide not to ride along anymore and just jump the hell off. And on that note, we'll wrap it up for today. This deep dive into the transition will continue, but for now, take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.